seem to have come out in the last year and a half, like Slow Dive and Teenage Fan Club, Chapter House and Boo Radley's, all seem to name-check you as the greatest influence on their lives and careers over the last couple of years. I mean, does that surprise you, or does that...
I wouldn't say all of those bands. I'd say maybe a couple of them, maybe one or two.
We are obsessed with measuring music. At first, there were record sale numbers. Then they became sold-out tour dates. But there's only one test that really guarantees eternal success in the music industry, the one of time. Days, months, and years are the only thing that proves how much a song is actually worth. And no band knows this better than My Bloody Valentine, who stepped on the scene as post-punkers and went on to make a record so shrouded in mystery and legend that it took 21 years to release a sequel worthy to follow it up. It's been 30 years, and we're all still haunted by the rumors, the intrigue, the suspicion, the widespread admiration, and ultimately unfathomable mystique of My Bloody Valentine.
They're the bands who turn up in 10 years, 12 years' time with Richard Skinner or somebody doing a kind of, you know, the My Bloody Valentine story, episode 12, The Difficult Years.
This is a series that dives in My Bloody Valentine's shoegazing ocean of noise. Join us in this video as we trace the steps that led to one of the most infamous recording processes in rock and roll history. Let's figure out how My Bloody Valentine made music timeless. It had been almost a year since the elusive My Bloody Valentine had released their debut album on Creation Records. Isn't Anything took the underground rock scene in England by storm, with its abrasive rhythm and soft dissonance. Because of this success and the relatively fast recording process of their previous EP, You Made Me Realize, the CEO of Creation Records, Alan McGee, gave the band access to new studios to put together a new miraculous album. But he had made a big mistake. He had underestimated Kevin Shields.
I don't have a home, so I have a place to put my stuff, you know, but I haven't got a home. That's the next phase, you know, get a home.
Kevin Shields was the man behind the sound of the Valentines by virtue of a passion for guitar noise experimentation that verged on obsession. Instead of strumming along, Kevin played while holding his guitar's tremolo arm to give songs their oddly molten, wavering rhythm.
Instead of just going, you know, I got to... And that really creates all these juxtapositions of tone.
He did this out of frustration to express himself physically with guitars, letting the ebb and flow of his grip subconsciously control the entire timbre of the track. Kevin thought of himself as a painter, with the studio instruments as his colors, which he mixed to illustrate his own imperceptible vision. But there was a problem. No one else was allowed to stain the canvas. Kevin refused to work with studio engineers when they insisted on dictating means of mixing and production of his sounds, asking them not to come into the studio at all, and if they truly had to wait in the lobby as he recorded. Unlike his previous efforts, Kevin Shields made it a mission for the new album, Loveless, to have memories as strong and memorable as its impenetrable blended vocal tracks. And so, the recording crusade began. As they bounced from cheap studio to cheap studio, My Bloody Valentine found themselves arguing with the in-house producers who gave them unsolicited advice on the sound of the record, which Kevin didn't take too kindly. By 1990, the band agreed to release a 4-track EP, Glider, before the album was set to come out. The title referenced Kevin's bent guitar, which he jokingly called Glide Guitar. But the title track was anything but funny. An instrumental 3 minutes of pure agonizing drones and strident bombardments of looped, swirling, and sampled basses and guitars dive-bombing each other. Kevin was called insane for doing the track by many of the engineers he worked with. The band moved to Trident 2 Studio to mix the single Soon with producer Alan Moulder, a decisively more accessible dance track bathed in an ocean of background fuzz. The song became a minor hit, with legendary music icon Brian Eno commenting that it set a new standard for pop. But after a short tour to promote it, the band returned to the studio uninspired.
Started making Loveless, Nightmare.
It went on to this massive kind of going from studio to studio. Creation would find a studio, it was about to close and stick us in there for another month or something.
Kevin took the whole summertime on feedback sampling to expand the track to Here Knows When, a song creation executives were not extremely happy about, thinking it had been recorded on faulty tape due to the surging and receding quality of the guitar drones. A wash of sound that instantly sent listeners soaring but didn't stop the label from buzzing with worry as 1990 came to a close. To Here Knows When became the single for the Tremolo EP, the second EP before Loveless, marking exactly 2 years since the band first began recording the album. A young engineer, Guy Fixon, spent his 22nd birthday starting a new job as the drum mixer for the EP. It would end up lasting a total of 18 months, where he facilitated the release of what was going to become Tremolo, the 7-track EP that had to be cut to 4 tracks, with mesmerizing secret codas. Contrary to popular belief, the time Kevin Shields spent in the studio wasn't abusing effects, pedals, and distortion. In fact, many of the tracks on the album don't actually use more than a single guitar track and just a touch of reverse reverb.
Direct, even though people might think it sounds a bit kind of ethereal or something, it's actually listen to it, is even the soft guitar sounds are actually very direct soft guitar sounds, in the sense that they're not full of reverb and stuff. People think we do. We use tons of reverb. We don't, and we don't use that many effects either. It's the way we play the guitar makes things seem to sound they can't grasp them. So when they can't grasp it, they think, oh, it must be ethereal and far away, but it isn't really. It's actually very direct.
Anxiety over recording costs, however, was still growing. The problems the band faced by recording at cheap studios were incompatible with Kevin's mindset. Creation knew the band now worked slowly and decided there was no point putting them in an expensive studio.
We worked very slowly. It wasn't like being a perfectionist, as in doing things over and over again. We just did everything very slow, a few hours a day.
This meant the 25 or so studios Loveless was recorded in weren't looked after properly, or that they were run by questionable people. One of them owned Elephant Studio, located in the then degraded Docklands of London. He claimed he was hiding out because MI5, the British Secret Service, was after him. Engineers were being fired all the time, complaining that the 4 Hz frequency was going to distort the record, and that the band members were the only ones who seemed to believe in Kevin's vision. They couldn't get the weirdness of the record, the warpiness of Loveless, and instead sat in the corner, looking with scorn at the improvised makeshift blanket forts Kevin constructed as sound booths. My Bloody Valentine fought their daily difficulties with a determined desire to break through sound, but it became too much to bear. Kevin Shields commented, "We were watching TV. We were watching the Romania, the war in the Gulf, the famine, the floods. Faced with that, I would have had the feeling to be a coward if deserting. Our position is finally so comfortable, so pleasant. Those events commanded humility. I'd got so many chances being there in the studio with just a record to finish. To match this sluggish space, most of the record was constituted of overdubbed samples of the band's own original instrumentation with feedback and bends rendered unrecognizable. Drummer Colm O'Cusack became the ghost of Loveless, as most of his percussion tracks were all programmed from samples. He began squatting around London after he had lost his home and couldn't afford to pay the deposit on a new flat, which Creation had refused to finance. When his girlfriend got deported to America and he got a bad long flu mixed with all the stress, he stopped coming into the studio. And the things with the elusive Belinda Butcher were not much easier. Belinda Butcher was the co-singer, guitarist, and occasional lyricist of the band, whose beguiling dancing and striking gaze had become its symbol. Much of the lyrical content of the Valentine's music was colored by the feelings and emotions she shared during her relationship with Kevin Shields. But by the Loveless sessions, it was unraveling. Her ex-boyfriend and father of her young son was threatening to break in the apartment she lived in with Kevin, so he used the studio as a getaway. He would average out a couple of hours a day of serious work. Even recording the band's deliberately mysterious and seductive musings became a Herculean task. To this day, the band has never released the correct interpretation of their lyrics, insisting they were unconscious, broken sentences, and weird lines coming from the subconscious, which Kevin would sing and leave Belinda to interpret as actual words. Kevin wanted them to be just another instrument in the mix, layering them on top of each other and breaking out his favorite tracks to create an accidental, whispered and airy tone. By then, he had been averaging around 3 hours of sleep a night, and was living in a perpetually hypnagogic daze, writing lyrics tired at night while Belinda recorded hers early in the morning. Their relationship had also been unraveling for unrelated reasons, but his intense schedule made things significantly more difficult. Loveless was called Loveless not just because of a relationship breaking down, but because the whole process of making Loveless was difficult. With motivation dwindling, the pace of production slowed down until Kevin was finally told that Creation was close to going under. The record was finally finished in the summer of 1991, and by then, bassist Debbie Gooch was shocked to see it finally happen. After its release, a famous rumor of it costing an alleged £250,000 began circulating. Creation figureheads insist that Kevin Shields was deliberately ambiguous on the duration of his studio recording sessions. Apparently, he would respond to demands as to when his magnum opus would be finished by blankly reciting My Bloody Valentine song titles. To Hear Knows When You Sleep, Sometimes, Soon. Pat Fish of the Jazz Butcher, another musician on the label, claims that he couldn't eat because of Kevin Shields.
I kind of sort of believed his own hype, really, to be honest. You know, that kind of like, it was kind of sad, really, you know what I mean? You know, because it's like the papers were telling him that, you know, that he was God's gift to music.
Kevin, on the other hand, asserted that Creation only paid him and Colm £50 a week, which was not enough to even afford housing. He also stated that Creation was no longer being supported by Rough Trade Records, and was in a semi-startup broke state when the recording of Loveless began. And in fact, by the time the record was done, they had actually grown in size and signed more commercially viable bands. The record label staff also had a particularly pronounced love for partying and drugs, which had become an expensive habit. Kevin has also said that Alan McGee fed the story to the press because it would have done him good in the long run, but also knew it wasn't true.
They did spend, I think, around £270,000 making the record, but they didn't bankrupt Creation. Me and Dick, being out of minds, nearly bankrupted Creation. It wasn't any individual's fault.
And the message being put across is that art isn't worth it if it's not financially viable, no matter how good it is. Instead of the record company being the bad guys, it's the band. The creative people are the bad guys taking poor corporate companies' money. The critical acclaim of Loveless wasn't enough for Creation, which dropped the band in 1992, a year before they signed Oasis. Like many other shoegazing bands of the early 90s, My Bloody Valentine didn't market themselves as personalities or showmen. The music was to do all the talking. Loveless's abrasive guitars speaking for all the anxiety and inertia of a generation and transforming it into the product of another world. But Kevin Shields had not set out to make a weird avant-garde record. The particularity of Loveless was that it had an extreme simplicity and normality to it that was ambiguous enough to unsettle listeners. A sonic uncanny valley that was abrasive enough to induce them into a trance, rather than a full-on extraterrestrial orchestra. Kevin expected critics to pan the album just by sheer virtue of how many times My Bloody Valentine was being name-dropped by other bands due to the success of Isn't Anything, their previous album, believing himself not to be able to live up to the hype of 1988.
In an interview, just when Loveless came out, I said we're talking about years before people will even begin to talk about this record on the level that I'm hearing it. And everyone was like, that's really arrogant. And yet at the time, it's, in retrospect, once I was right, but I wasn't wrong either. Were written about in a much more accurate way now than at the time when it was just underwater guitars, millions of overdubs, mumble vocals. It was just, mostly wrong. You know what I mean? They weren't really true.
The record has become somewhat of a revered cliché in the world of indie music fans, with all the bombastic praise showered upon it for the last 30 years, painting an impossible picture in the mind of most listeners.
I was just completely and utterly blown away by it. It was one of those records that you'd waited so long, you'd gone past the point of even thinking like, it can't possibly be anywhere near as good as everyone thinks it's going to be, because it's taken 15 times longer than it should have done. And then it went on even longer, and you thought, it doesn't really matter, I'm not even fussed about hearing it. And there's always been, and there will always be my top 10 albums of everything I've ever heard in 40 plus, almost 50 years now. It's that big.
It is a renowned fact that most who end up listening to My Bloody Valentine for the first time may not entirely appreciate their music. In this peculiar phenomenon, we warm up to the sound gradually, with repeated listens that engulf us in this world of endless noise.
Like, even just on initial impact, this thing hit me, like, across the face. Like, I'm kind of lost for words. There's no way in hell that after one listen I can really completely say how I feel. There was so much to this album that just is beyond words. I didn't pay attention to a single word. I've occasionally picked up one word, but everything was so buried. Everything was so noisy, intricate.
Basically, no one did us any favours for years until we made music that people liked, you know.
Yeah, so how come all of a sudden they did like you?
Because we made better music.
This is what makes My Bloody Valentine's music timeless. Written and recorded in its own universe, disregarding trends and seemingly too inconsistent to be commercial. Kevin Shields always looked forward to the passage of time and practice to improve his sense of musicianship, likening it to the seniority enjoyed by most academics. He looked forward to growing older and getting better, unlike most of his other contemporaries, who longed to be young forever. Modernity, however, is about context, not content. That's why the exciting charting Soon, my favorite track, is now the one that easily sounds the most 90s. And things like the 30-second impressionistic sample experiment Touched, composed by Colm Cusack, are effectively exempted from standing the test of time. The ageless quality of Loveless, however, has caused a new generation to discover the album and grasp its importance. Kevin Shields has commented, "I know everything comes from other music. It's like a language. In themselves, the words are neither new nor original. What really counts is the way you're placing them, your own way to build the sentence. All I want is to create my own language, my syntax. And for My Bloody Valentine, Loveless was only one part of the whole picture." Join us in the next and consistently uncommercial installment of the My Bloody Valentine saga, where we go back in time to trace the origins of the band that reinvented rock music through volume and established the seductive sound of shoegaze. Until then, thank you for watching, and we hope you will subscribe for more content. See you on the next video for more stories behind the music.